In a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, an elderly couple, lived in a charming little house surrounded by blooming flowers. They loved keeping track of the happenings in their neighborhood, often peeking out of their window to observe their neighbors. One day, a moving truck pulled up next door. A young couple had bought the house, and they were moving in. From their living room window, the Johnsons watched as the young couple carried furniture and boxes into their new home. The young man accidentally dropped a large box, scattering books onto the ground. The young woman rushed to help him, laughing as they picked up the books together. Mrs. Johnson frowned and whispered to her husband, "They're so clumsy. I hope they're not going to be noisy or careless neighbors." Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement. "We'll see. Time will tell," he said, leaning back in his chair. A few days later, Mrs. Johnson saw the young woman hanging clothes to dry in the backyard. She leaned closer to the window and squinted. "Would you look at that?" she said to her husband. "Their laundry is full of stains. How can they not notice? Don't they know how to wash clothes properly?" Mr. Johnson glanced up from his newspaper and shrugged. "Maybe they're not used to doing laundry," he said. Every time the young woman hung her laundry to dry, Mrs. Johnson would comment. "It's the same thing every day," she muttered. "Their clothes always look so dirty. I just don't understand how they can live like that." Her husband chuckled and said, "You're paying too much attention to their laundry. Maybe you should mind your own." But Mrs. Johnson couldn't stop herself. Day after day, she criticized the young couple. "Poor kids," she'd say. "They really need someone to teach them how to clean properly." One morning, Mrs. Johnson got up early and went to the window as usual. She was ready to make her daily observation about the laundry. But to her surprise, the clothes on the line were perfectly clean, white, and spotless. "Finally," she exclaimed, "it looks like someone taught her how to wash clothes properly." Mr. Johnson looked up from his cup of coffee and smiled. "Actually," he said, "I cleaned our windows this morning." Mrs. Johnson turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" Mr. Johnson chuckled. "The stains weren't on the laundry, dear. They were on our window." Mrs. Johnson's face turned red with embarrassment. She realized she had been judging her neighbors unfairly, not because of anything they had done, but because her own perspective was clouded. Feeling ashamed, Mrs. Johnson decided to change her attitude. That afternoon, she baked a batch of cookies and went next door to introduce herself properly. The young couple welcomed her warmly, and Mrs. Johnson realized how kind and friendly they were. From that day on, she stopped making assumptions and started focusing on the good in people. She and the young couple became good friends, often sharing stories and laughter over tea. Moral of the story: before judging others, take a moment to reflect on your own perspective. Sometimes, the flaws we see in others are actually reflections of our own misunderstandings or shortcomings. A clear view starts with looking inward. After watching the whole video, we have learned as following. What we should do: reflect before judging. Pause and think before forming opinions. Clear your perspective. Ensure your view isn't clouded by bias. Focus on positives. Look for the good in people. Show kindness. Approach others with empathy and warmth. Understand context. Seek to understand rather than assume. What we should not do: don't jump to conclusions. Avoid quick assumptions. Don't focus on flaws. Stop fixating on imperfections. Don't gossip or criticize. Avoid unnecessary negativity. Don't assume intentions. Refrain from attributing bad motives. Don't hold prejudices. Let go of preconceived judgments. By practicing self-awareness and kindness, we can build better relationships and avoid unnecessary misunderstandings.